Today's Bible passage is the most important passage of the Bible. This is not my opinion. This is the opinion of Martin Luther and John Calvin. Now, you probably heard of those guys, all right? And you know what they stand for, who they are. They are the founders of Protestantism. They are in the forefront of the Reformation, and they both said that this passage that is in our message today is the core, the very heart, the most important passage of the Old and New Testament. The passage focuses on the topic of righteousness. That righteousness is imperative for God. It is a must. And this imperative is not only an imperative for God, but an imperative for man. Because righteousness is at the very heart of God, at his very core, a part of his nature. But the problem is that man can't attain righteousness, and so God has to find a way to offer it. And then, being made righteous, fellowship with God is possible, and it brings us into reconciliation. Many of you are parts of clubs and groups. You might be a part of a car group, a sports group. You may feel very close to other Laker fans. Well, maybe not this year, but in other years. You know, we're just naturally, like the saying goes, birds of a feather, what do? They flock together. Yeah, we just have that natural tendency to find affinity with those who are like us. And so God says, because he is holy and righteous, we have to be that way as well. 1 Peter 1:16, let me just read it to you. Since it is written, quote, "You shall be holy, for I am holy." And Leviticus 27 says the same thing. All right? Now, while you're reading that, I'm going to turn off the fan. So I don't get more dried up. And so today we come to this core explanation about why the sacrifice by Jesus was effective for our restoration to God. And it all relates back to the topic of righteousness. In fact, when I read this passage to you, you're going to see how the word righteousness occurs several times in 6 verses. And not only the word righteousness, but the words like just, justified, justifier, it's the same word. And so it pervades this passage. Now, because Paul speaks and writes like a philosopher, like a theologian, like a lawyer, this is going to take a little bit of unpacking. So I'm going to go verse by verse, and I'm going to explain as we go along so that you understand the passage. All right, so let's go to Romans chapter 3, starting at verse 21. And I want you to see the first 2 words that are on there. But now. The but now tells you that we are in a transition. We're transitioning from a very long section. Romans chapter 1, verse 18, through all the rest of the chapter, through all of chapter 2. And then for the first 20 verses of chapter 3 is about one issue. The issue of sin and our inability to become righteous, but focusing mainly on the point of the fact that we are all sinners. And then this conclusion comes after 64 verses in that long passage at verse 20, where it says, "For by works of the law, no human being will be justified in God's sight." And that's what brings us to this verse where it says, "But now." And when Paul says, "but now," he means since Jesus' death, and resurrection. So after the death and resurrection, now something new has happened. Something new is possible. That after his death and after our failure of attaining righteousness on our own, here's what it says. But now the righteousness of God has been manifested, made visible, made known, apart from the law, even though actually the law and the prophets bear witness to it, meaning the law and the prophets, in other words, the Old Testament, they talk about Jesus and his life and his death. This was known in the Old Testament, although it might not have been clear. And so he says, now it is clear. The next verse, Romans 3, and I'm going to break it apart into 3 parts. The first part, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. This is what it is. And then he says, who should receive it? The next portion of verses, for there is no distinction. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So everybody, Jews and non-Jews, have fallen short of God's standard of glory. And that's why God used 64 verses to lay it out. But because all are unrighteous, both Jews and Gentiles, no differentiation, now we are all justified, verse 24, by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. So through Jesus' efforts, we are now justified by grace as a gift. He has bought us back. The next verse, again, breaking it down, Jesus Christ, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. Now, the word propitiation is kind of a technical word, all right? Last time you used propitiation was what? It probably doesn't even show up on your SAT exams, okay? This is how rare it's used. It's a technical word, and what it talks about is it means that adequate payment to satisfy the fine. If I have a parking ticket, 1 hour zone, and I was 2 minutes over 1 hour, and they tell me I got to pay $47. You think I can round it off and send in $40? No way, right? 40, you better round it up, huh? If you don't pay it fully and on time, they'll round it up. They'll tack on another $100. He says, take that for satisfaction. So anyway, it says an adequate payment to satisfy the fine, to make good, to put away, and here's the heart of the word, propitiation. Not just to satisfy, but to put away the affront and injury, or you might say the insult to the righteous indignation and wrath of the person affronted. Some of you, I don't know, you like to watch court TV. I don't mean like Judge Judy, okay? But like when they show a whole trial, you're watching the Pistorius trial going on in South Africa or one of those things. Well, after the person is found guilty and it's time for the sentencing, what happens now? You are allowed as a family member to come and to speak before the final sentencing. And at that time, what you hear is from parents and families of victims. They tell of their anger, how they feel. They're crying out for justice. They don't want to see a slap on the wrist. They want full justice. And they want to feel personal satisfaction. They want to have their unhappiness, even their anger, put away. Now, because anger has been so abused, we don't understand anger. But anger, at its root, is basically just like when we cut ourselves or physically injure ourselves, what do we feel? Physical pain. Anger is emotional pain that we feel. And that's all it is, and we call it anger. And so there is that pain on the part of those family members, and they want that satisfaction, and so they come before the court to express it. All right, and now we come to the second two parts of verse 25, and I remember reading this part when I was in college, and I have always remembered it. It made such an impression on me. It says, this is to show God's righteousness. Jesus' death is to show God's righteousness because in his divine forbearance, he had passed over former sins. Doesn't mean he had not known or taken it into account. But it's like you call a policeman now, somebody runs over your bicycle, you're a CSUN student, all right? When are those cops going to come? Maybe never. Okay? They can't get around to it. They got to respond to more immediate things. Well, what happens is God is saying, I can't deal with this yet because, number one, you're not ready for it. So when Jesus comes, we're going to deal with it. But until then, don't get the wrong idea that I don't care. He says, I am forbearing these former sins. I'm not going to strike down mankind like I did when I sent the flood. I am not going to strike down your city like I did Sodom and Gomorrah. I remember growing up as a young collegiate, and I'd hear some people kid about how God should send down fire and brimstone on San Francisco, or at least on the North Beach area where they were starting to have all those nudie bars, right? So God didn't do that. He says, but now he is doing it to show his righteousness at the present time so that he would be what? Just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. By allowing his son to die, he shows not only that justice is to be fulfilled, but he is going to be the one to take care of it. So I'm fighting this ticket. And I was a few minutes over the 2-hour mark. And I got this ticket over at Fuller Seminary. And I think I'm going to win because I did move my car. But because I moved the car to the next street over, the person thinks I didn't move the car. They only looked at the chalk mark. Okay? Well, let's say I get an unrighteous judge. And I says, this is what happened. He says, I don't care. We need the money in Pasadena. I'm going to fine you anyway. Okay? And let's say Rita, I take Rita with me to court that day. And Rita says, here's a pastor. I'm not going to let him have to pay. I'm going to pony up the money. Would you do that, Rita? Oh, yeah. All right. Even better. That's wonderful. But suppose Rita was the judge. And the judge steps off the bench. And he says, bailiff, here's the fine. You give it to the clerk, and the clerk will turn it into the office. That's what that phrase means. Not only is he just, he doesn't turn a blind eye towards sin, but he is also the justifier. He makes the payment. And so the summary of the passage is this. All have sinned, but righteousness can still be ours through trusting Jesus' sacrifice. But finally, that's because God has righteously provided righteousness. Now, I just want to make a couple of points on this passage, and then we're going to hear from our brother Philip. It's going to take a bit, but just 2 points really. First, the fact is about the reality and the depth of man's universal failure of righteousness and his resulting enslavement to sin. First, how it's universal. You guys have been tracking the news. How many of you are news junkies like me? Okay, a few of you. So I'm going to need to explain to the rest. All right? But almost every week, there's a new scandal, right? A new problem. This week, we got this legislator from Louisiana caught on camera kissing a staffer. She's married to somebody else, has family. He's married to somebody else, has family. And he promised to run to restore faith in Congress and restore values. Okay? But this week, the Pope, no less, asked for forgiveness for the abuse, the sex abuse that has gone on in the Catholic Church. And I'm not picking on the Catholics, because at the end of last week, a mega church Protestant pastor in Florida had to resign while he was being fired by his church because he had been unfaithful as well. And my attitude is, when I read these things, I think, there but for the grace of God go I, because I'm just as susceptible as anybody else, because we're all made of flesh. Okay? And so flesh is weak. And my prayer is, God, give me the strength to run like a dog with his tail on fire. That's my prayer. That's what Joseph did. He ran as fast as he could. Okay? And that's what all flesh should do. So it's universal. But our denial shows the depth of sin in us, the way we will not own up to it. And as we've watched these media scandals, I have begun to notice how quick and easily people are in asking for forgiveness and almost asking as if they have a right to expect it and to keep on doing their job, right? They're asking this Louisiana legislator to resign. His own governor says to resign. And he says, no, I'm going to just keep doing my job. And you've seen that. So that forgiveness is now a growing expectation. People want forgiveness without making amends, without change. But let's face it, ladies, if you're cooking a recipe that the family doesn't like, are you going to keep cooking that recipe? No, you change recipes. You got to come and make the change. And these guys will continue to doing the same thing without making any sort of change. Now, the part that irritates me the most is how the people ask for forgiveness. In the past, you have seen people go on media, and they would publicly apologize, and sometimes they would be in tears, and they will say, I've sinned. Right? You've seen that. Now, this is the way they put it. I made a mistake. Or worse, I exercised bad judgment. Like I chose an Infiniti instead of a Honda, or whatever, Or, this is the one I hate the worst. If my actions have caused pain to some of you, like he's pointing a finger at you for feeling bad, right? For being angry. If my actions, very neutral, right? My actions, why are you oversensitive? Get over it. It's almost like what he's saying. And it's crazy, but that's the way it's coming out. Like they're hiding behind the presumption of innocence. And so this is the way we are neutralizing and sanitizing sin, taking the moral content out of it, calling it bad judgment. And we're smart enough and sophisticated enough to delude ourselves. with that kind of an attitude. And so it's kind of sad. And I know that these people have all learned it from our people in Congress, people with the money to buy the publicity helpers. And so they know how to put the spin on it. So that's why God in his wisdom, before getting to chapter 3, verse 21 to 26, spent the bulk from 118 to 320 hammering away at this simple truth. For all have sinned. And some have evaded this way, some have evaded this way, but all have sinned. And he's got to get that point across, and he uses 64 verses to do that. Then by the time we get to this passage, 2 verses later, he says it again to make sure that we get the message. Let me quote from another teacher, because this is what he says. He says, we need to see how hopeless and helpless we are. He says, quote, we are born into this world enslaved to sin on a sinking boat. God holds out a life jacket to us, but until we become convinced that our plight is truly desperate, we'll never joyously and tenaciously grab hold of what's being offered to us. Let me continue the quote. The intent of God in clearly exposing our sinfulness isn't to make us feel bad. It's to make us feel desperate. Wow, not to feel bad. He wants us to feel desperate. And then he finishes this way. Desperate enough to wrestle with the question of the ages. And he quotes Job chapter 9, verse 2. How can a person be righteous before God? And that's the end of the quote. And so we need to know that it's serious stuff. That this is not just some infraction, but this is some serious part of our nature. And we don't say, I'm sorry if my actions, God, have caused you some sort of pain for some reason, somehow. That we have sinned. Sin must be by divine, not human standards judged. It is God we have sinned against. Often, it's not the junkies, the prostitutes, and other desperate people who don't understand sin. You ask any one of them, and they know they are sinners. It's people like us. White-collar people, I call us, who fall into the danger. People who grow up in Christian homes, going to church, being high class or well-educated. We have the trouble seeing the reality of sin. And we can become those who don't really believe, don't really feel like we are sinners, because we compare against those prostitutes, those junkies, and those other desperate people. But God says no, for all have sinned and fallen short of what standard? The glory of God. That's the standard, because He's the one that we have violated. We don't need to be an axe murderer, somebody who's committed heinous, terrible acts. R.C. Sproul, in his book, The Truth of the Cross, says that we are described as sinners in 3 ways. We are debtors, we are criminals, and we are enemies. Debtors. No wonder Jesus taught us in the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our debts daily. We are debtors because we owe our Maker and Provider, the one who has all authority over us, we owe Him allegiance and obedience, but we haven't shown it properly, right? So that's the first one. We are criminals. In other words, we are lawbreakers. The Westminster Catechism says this. The question is, what is sin? And this is the answer that the theologians have come up with. Sin is any want of conformity to or transgression of the law of God. Any failure to obey, any breaking of the law of God, the Word of God, this is what makes us criminals. This is what makes us lawbreakers. We are not the judges to interpret the law. We are not the legislators to make new laws, to make up our own laws. God is that. And then third, we are enemies of God. We show enmity instead of love. And when he tries to reign in us, we get surly, resentful, hostile, even defiant. Christians do this. You know, the two most popular songs in non-Christian funerals, one of them is Frank Sinatra's song, guess which one? I Did It My Way. Okay? Number two, for Christians, we get upset. We get treated like when our parents want us to do something and we throw a hissy fit. And so this is how we turn into enemies. We get passive aggressive, we get resentful, we just go like that towards God. So, sin is real. Sin is universal. Sin is deep. And we have to come to recognize that before we are desperate enough to love his salvation. Second, God is in his most basic nature righteous. And so he became righteous in judgment and righteous in providing salvation. But people, when he delayed, started wondering, and they started to get the feeling like perhaps Jehovah has grown old and soft. After all, eternity is a long time. No, God doesn't change. And so his righteousness has not changed. And since he created us in his image, that righteousness needs to be a part of us. It is written into our hearts. And this feeling of need for righteousness starts early and in so many different ways. Let me give you some examples. Little kids at a party, they watch to see how the cake is sliced. Why? Make sure my piece is as big as his piece, right? Later on, we're going to cut the cake. Fill up, you only have to make a ceremonial cut, all right? So nobody will give you any trouble about that. But that's what happens. We don't get our turn on the playground. We turn to somebody that want justice. If somebody else gets away with something, then we call foul. But when we get away with something, we think we're so smart, right? We're so clever. In basketball, I love it when you are getting fouled. If you can fake getting fouled by acting and selling it to the referee, then we can get some free throws. But you get the other person fouled out on top of that. Isn't that great? That's how perverted we've become in our justice and righteousness. But it's ingrained in us. And then we come back to the word propitiation. And like I said, it's not like God doesn't feel the hurt. See, we think God should not get angry. But like I said, anger is just the signal of being hurt emotionally. And so, God has to eat it up. He has had to suck it up. All humanity, all this sin. He has been swallowing his grief. He has been swallowing up his pain. He has been swallowing up his anger and holding his tongue and not acting until the right time when Jesus came to die. It wasn't something clinical and dispassionate. It's not like the doctor who comes in and examines you and rips off the bandage and you go, ow, that hurt. That's clinical. Your mom comes in and says, oh, we got to check the bandage. And so she gets you distracted, and she gives you something to do so you're not going to feel the pain as much. And she very tenderly, gently peels it off. Same result, but an entirely different treatment. And so God does feel the pain. Well, let me give you some meaningful way of really making this something vital in our lives. David in Psalm 51 pleaded with God for something. He says, God, restore to me the joy of my salvation. Sin has taken it away. Restore to me the joy of my salvation. Salvation should fill us with joy. And my question is, does our salvation fill us with joy? You know that next week is Easter. If it's joyful, if your salvation is joyful, you would think of sharing it with someone. I see a good movie. I find a new restaurant. I want to tell people about it. I want to take you to it. How many Christians have given no thought to inviting somebody who supposedly is precious to them to come to God's house, to know God, to worship God on this great holy holiday? And so there is, across the land among Christians, a loss of that joy. My fear is some people never knew the joy because they never thought sin is something I'm in desperation about. And so salvation is meaningless to them. Salvation is like a $5 tip, and perhaps you were expecting a $20 tip. I believe that there are people who see that as just another thing to buy, like the latest gadget, something to have just in case I want to mess with it. So they have never seen sin, and they've never needed this salvation desperately because we have not known the conviction. Perhaps we've used the relative measure of sin. Well, I'm better than those guys over there, the junkies and the prostitutes, and we haven't looked at our own need. Perhaps we have not realized the glory God has for us, that He wanted us to be glorious like Him. When you see the picture of Christians in Revelation, they glow. No wonder we don't need any light in heaven. We won't even need an iPhone with a flashlight app because we're going to glow. We're going to take part in God's glory. That's why He made us in His image and likeness. That's the kind of people we want to be. And so this is what I do. All right, two things. Because when I find I've lost my joy, it's like, to me, spiritually, a low-grade fever. You know how it is when you have a low-grade fever, right? You can still go to work, but it feels like, I think a lot of Christians live in that way. So the first thing I do is I try to get myself healthy. I try to make sure that all my sins are covered daily through confession. And I keep track of it by not looking at other people's sins. I'm looking at the beam, as Jesus said, in my eye, and not the speck in others. Because that's my responsibility. You're not my responsibility. I'm my responsibility. I have to tell it and teach it, But when it comes to judging sin, I've got to judge my sin. Second, in my old age, I spent 10 years working on building up my heart, aerobics. Now I'm building up my muscles, and I've maxed out on quite a few machines, but I'm nothing like Jiaming. All right, because I'm fighting osteoporosis, because that's what happens with people in old age. I'm working on balance. I'm working on core strength. You may not believe it. And I'm working on flexibility. I want, when I am parking my car, to be able to spin all the way around without relying on that mirror. You know, spiritually, have you advanced? Have you found and exercised some new spiritual muscle? Are you the same as when you were first reborn? Or perhaps worse? Then you need a spiritual conditioning program. And so these are the things I do to help me to appreciate the salvation that has been given to us. And so my recommendation for you is that same, to ask God to show you the reality and the awfulness of sin on the one hand, to deal with it regularly in our lives, and then to get into something that's going to move you further along spiritually. Okay,